Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the P.A.D webinar series. Before I introduce you to our presenter, I'd like to thank Cliff Schechter, past International Justice and Distinguished Service Chapter member who was instrumental in connecting Phi Alpha Delta with the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you, Cliff, for all your dedication to P.A.D and the work of the Anti-Defamation League. Also, thank you to the Initiative 1 Committee with Michelle Isherwood, who has been developing topics for these webinar series, and we are very happy to present this topic, which is very important to us. Our topic tonight is bias, hate, and speech in the digital age, and it's presented by Lauren Croft. Lauren serves as the National Policy Counsel for the Anti-Defamation League. She oversees ADL's civil rights work and policy initiatives to decrease hate online and promote the use of technology to counter bias. Lauren also serves as ADL's counsel for free speech and civil rights issues on college and university campuses. Lauren is also a P.A.D member and served as the marshal of the 4 chapter at Loyola School in Los Angeles. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please use the chat feature. And we will also have a brief question and answer at the end of the presentation. We may do it by the chat feature, or we may open it up to the actual phone, unmute everybody, and have just an open discussion. For now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Lauren Croft. Lauren, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew, and everybody. Alan. The whole Phi Alpha Delta community. It is awesome to be doing this webinar with a group that was so formative to me during my law school years. I know we have some law students listening tonight, so hang in there. And I'm really excited to talk about an issue that I deal with on a daily basis, and one that I think is going to just continue to pervade public conversation, and also the way in which we handle legal issues in the future. So bias, hate, and speech in the digital age. Now this again is a really vast topic, and I'm going to drill down and talk about ADL, what ADL is doing in this space, and some of the things that we're thinking about for the future. Also, like Andrew said, at the end there will be an opportunity for questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please put it in the chat function. We'll be sure to address it either during presentation, at the end, or after. If my contact information will be up on the last slide, please feel free to reach out to me. Excited to be here. So just going to walk you through how we'll spend our next hour, or a little bit of less than an hour, because I definitely want to make sure there's time for questions. But going to set the stage a little, talk about hate in cyberspace, which feels like an incredibly outdated term, but important to kind of see where things started in this arena. Then talk a little bit about ADL's approach, who are the targets, what law and policy do we have on the books, and finally, how does ADL fight online hate and harassment? Hate in cyberspace. So I'm going to read a quote to you. It is a quote by John Perry Barlow, who was the former founder, or who is the founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, also a musician, a politician, and he, in an essay that he wrote called "The Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace," he put this. I'm going to read it out loud, which I rarely do with slides, but I think it's an interesting way to start. He said, "We are creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice, accorded by race, economic power, military force, or station of birth. We'll create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before." And Barlow genuinely believed this, but as we know now, this couldn't be further from the truth. We know that systems of oppression that exist online certainly exist on the ground. Opposite. We know systems of oppression that exist on the ground certainly exist online. Hate, harassment, and bias all pervade in both spaces, because the spaces are sort of interchangeable and often interplay with the other. So when people talk about crime that is quote unquote real world crime, and if I was in person, I would be doing air quotes around real world, I tend to push back, and I really try to point out the amount of time and effort we spend online, the way we use it to bolster our professional careers, to keep in touch with family and friends, to learn about the news, etc. And just as our dependence on the internet and its sort of interplay between our world on the ground, pervades the rest of life, so too does it reflect a lot of the issues that we know exist in our world today. Just as a follow-up, when Barlow, he's since passed away, but when he was confronted about this quote in this essay later on in life, and he even kind of backed off a little and said, you can't always get it exactly right. He also acknowledged that this fair and humane world isn't so fair. So to back up a little and talk about the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL. I'm hearing people might not be able to hear me. Is this better? Let's see. Why not? Sure that I can speak up. Okay, great. So the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, was founded in 1913 with a dual-part mission: to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. And the ADL was founded in light of and in response to, in part, the Leo Frank conviction, the conviction of a Jewish man who was later determined to be wrongfully accused of murdering a young girl and then lynched. And this two-part mission, to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice, was set forth because ADL recognized, even in 1913, that in order to fight one form of hate or bigotry, you have to fight all forms of hate. And they are interconnected and interwoven and come from the same deep roots. One of the frameworks with which ADL views and approaches issues regarding hate, bigotry, bias, and harassment is the pyramid of hate. And the pyramid of hate, it's something we use in all spheres of the work. And to back up, ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, has sort of three different approaches to countering their mission: stopping the defamation of Jewish people and to securing justice for all. And those three things are research and investigation. Our Center on Extremism is a leader in understanding extremist ideology, in breaking down issues that are pervading our communities, both on the ground and online, related to white supremacy, Islamophobia, and other forms of extremism. Our education team is incredibly robust and does anti-bias training and education from kindergarten all the way up to college and university campuses, and reaches millions of children and has reached millions of children. And we also educate law enforcement, tech companies, etc. And then we have our policy wing, which is where I sit on the civil rights team. And the policy team advocates and assists in furtherance of the mission. So all three of these areas of the organization really do approach the issue looking and considering this pyramid, which is that genocide doesn't happen overnight. And the way that it happens is that these lower rungs on the pyramid of hate are normalized or accepted in general conversation, in different areas of our sphere, and then they allow for the higher rungs to be accepted. So acts of bias. When jokes that are rooted in bigotry and discrimination are normalized, then acts of prejudice become okay, like social avoidance and ridicule of the general public. When those become normalized, then acts of discrimination become front and center and more validated, and so on and so forth. And we look at that similarly online, but also look at the way that different incidents become normalized and accepted in order to allow for things to go from an isolated offensive incident all the way up to campaign harassment or harassment. Now, one thing about the spectrum of online harassment is that I sort of lobby that it become a continuum, because the reality is all of these things, especially in the digital age and online, are far less linear. So an isolated offense can happen at the same time as campaign and network harassment because of the scope and ability to quickly and at scale put forward a message. It says that I'm having some issues with the sound and volume, so I'm going to try my best. But I do apologize. Just want to let you all know. Anyways, back to the spectrum of online harassment. This is how we look at events that go on online. So when somebody is a victim or target of online harassment, it might start with an isolated incident or name calling, etc. And then that might move to cyberbullying, which is these offensive comments directed at an individual or a group repetitively. Sometimes there's a power structure. Often this cyberbullying is the behavior that refers to this sort of action between young adults, youth, etc. Among adults, it would be called cyber stalking. Cyber violence is when there's consistent harassment and directed threats at other individuals. And then campaign or network harassment is when individual victim or target is like barraged, trolled, or approached. And it might be like in relation to an isolated incident and then blows up, continues, and can continue for months or even years. So who are the targets? Why is this an ADL issue? Well, in 2019, in February of this year, ADL conducted its first survey in this space called Online Hate and Harassment, the American Experience. And this survey, which again was put out in February, was a follow-up to a Pew survey that was put out the year before, tracking the American experience of online hate and harassment. And the way in which this study was conducted, because we have such little data from law enforcement and tech companies, was that there was a nationally representative survey that we engaged in, and individuals self-reported their experiences. And of those individuals found that, and it was again nationally representative, so that's the best data that we can get based on the constraints that we have. 53% of American adults have experienced some kind of online harassment. That was the big takeaway. Over half of American adults have experienced something in the form of harassment online. 38% of those stopped, reduced, or changed their behavior because of that. And the reason why we find that statistic so significant, because it might seem a little bit innocuous, is what I talked about in the beginning of this hour, which is that people's lives are so intrinsically connected with their online experience, whether that's for work, whether work requires you to engage on social media or engage just like we are now on a webinar, putting out articles, putting out contact information, etc. And also, again, keeping in touch with family and friends, being expected to be a global citizen, getting your news, and all the rest. So stopping, reducing, or changing your behavior for over a third of Americans, or for over a third of those harassed to do that, it's a pretty significant statistic. Now, this summer, we did the first of its kind, as far as we know, quantitative survey about online experiences in the gaming environment. And ADL is really focusing on what's going on in the gaming environment for a couple of reasons. One is that we know that gaming has a higher gross income than the music and regular entertainment industry combined. So this is the wave of the future. This is, we know esports and other forms of gaming that have become so intrinsic to the entertainment space, to younger generations, and also to older generations. The average gamer is 34, not 14. That's like a common myth. Additionally, in the gaming world, there are chat functions, audio functions, and video features that really make these spaces operate just as much like social media platforms as our conventional social media platforms. So it's something that ADL is really critically looking at. The other reason is this statistic that I have here. 23% of players reported that they were exposed to some discussion about white supremacist ideology on online multiplayer. And these are spaces where extremism, discussions about bigotry and bias are festering. And also, for those of you who are familiar or unfamiliar, Gamergate is a common term about sort of the exposure of, started with 3 individual women who were trolled, harassed, and completely terrorized online, who were part of the gaming community in August of 2014. This has been 5 years since then, there's been more research, more exposure about these environments, but still not enough. And that's why ADL, and specifically our Center for Technology and Society, is really looking at online gaming spaces, how it's used for recruitment, how individual players feel on the site, whether they feel attacked, harassed. So back to our February survey, found that around 53% of American adults had experienced some form of harassment, 37% some form of severe harassment, and that included all of the categories below. So physical threats, sexual harassment, stalking, and sustained harassment. And this was also particularly concerning to us because we knew through follow-up questions and also anecdotal evidence that not a lot of these cases are legally cognizable, are prosecuted in the courts, are brought to bear in civil court, etc. So there really is a lack for all of these crimes online, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But when somebody is being attacked with physical threats, sexual harassment, stalking, or sustained harassment, that's when the legal questions come into play and have sort of motivated our next steps for work in this space. We also wanted to consider how much identity comes into play when individual targets are harassed online. So unsurprisingly, a lot of individuals reported that they were harassed based on their identity, whether that was sexual orientation, religion, race, ethnicity, gender, etc. So these statistics are actually smaller than we anticipate will happen in the future because of two factors. One of which is that these are self-reported. So the way that our society considers online harassment and puts up with it might actually mean that the individuals who were reporting this type of abuse might not have understood that the exact negative, comments and other activity that they were experiencing actually digested to them was sort of in line with their identity. That's sort of a long way to say that the more that we get community awareness about online hate and harassment, the more that we think that individuals will start to connect the dots, saying that the things that I'm experiencing are actually, in part because of my identity. The dots are there, but until there's better awareness about what it means to be a victim or to be a target, what it means to receive this type of threat, I think that there is a little bit of a stopgap there. So I do anticipate that these percentages will increase over time. Again, this is not how many individuals in this category experience online harassment, but rather individuals in this category and the harassment they receive, how much of it is based on, or at least in part related to, their identity. And again, based on or in part related to really does open up the question. So we got all this data, and ADL wanted to sort of understand the real life experiences behind the data, because that is another area of the digital world, online hate and abuse, that seems to be missing, is this greater awareness and understanding of what it's like to be a victim or target of online hate or harassment. We just put out in October, in partnership with Bumble, the dating app, who's actually doing a lot of really neat advocacy work in this space, a report that was qualitative in nature. And it broke down the stories of 15 individuals who had experienced online harassment. What were the biggest problems and hurdles that they interfaced, et cetera? Because that's what's allowing that's what allowed us to further our advocacy work, because you can have numbers, but until you really understand someone's experience in a way that's concrete and clear, it's harder to advocate for specific measures to be taken. So we had 5 key findings come out of this report. And by the way, all of these reports are online at adl.org, and we'll also send out additional materials after this webinar, follow-up. The key findings are as follows, and I'm just going to read them and then talk a little bit about them. First, online hate incidents are frequently connected to the target's identity. Now, I went into this pretty extensively in the slides before, so I'm not going to stay on it, but I do want to clarify that when we say connected to the target's identity, it's not always the motivation, but sometimes can be in coordination with other motivations. Now, sometimes it is the key motivation. And then, of course, there's implicit and explicit motivations. All of that comes into play on the ground and online. Second takeaway, harassers use platform design to their advantage. So things like the fact that individuals cannot be blocked. So a target cannot block an individual based on IP address for a lot of these social media platforms. In fact, they can only block users. Well, harassers know that that's the case and often make multiple accounts to be able to harass an individual. Second is targets often experience so much harassment, thousands of tweets a day, let's say, in certain cases, hundreds of posts a day, and private messages. But for example, on Twitter, we're only able to report 5 messages bulk at a time. Further, they weren't able to report or at least acknowledge in, reporting this to individual platforms, the fact that these experiences were happening across multiple platforms. Third, online hate can cause significant emotional and economic damage. There was a lot of discussions around how these experiences impacted, obviously, emotional damage. Or I say obviously, but that might be more immediately understood, but also economic damage. It impacted their work life. It impacted their ability to get work. There's a couple of quotes that I have later on that will further expand upon this. And then, of course, we have our actual report that breaks down and annotates all of this as well, which again will be available to you. But the economic damage was one that was really found across the board. That there were a lot, this type of abuse really inhibited somebody's ability to keep or retain employment, and other economic factors as well. Fourth, harassers attack and impact others in the target's community. So ADL has historic work in the hate crime space. We developed model legislation decades ago that has been enacted in 45 states and at the federal level, hate crimes laws, basically allowing for penalty enhancements for hate crimes. Something that ADL says that we often say when we talk about hate crimes is that hate crimes are message crimes. They are, of course, directed at individuals or specific entities or people, but also a message to the entire community with which the person identifies. That's of some sort of protected class. In the same way, online crimes that relate to identity had that impact. Finally, social media platforms are not adequately designed to remove or efficiently review hateful content. Now, some of that was things like bulk reporting. Others of it was the fact that content moderation seems to be not adequate enough. The ability to, again, understand harassment across platforms. Something that our Center for Technology and Society often points to is, and these numbers aren't exactly correct, but they are generalized and make a strong point. I think that Facebook is supported in over 200 languages, 250, maybe more, and only as content moderators in about 40. Now, again, it might be 41 or 253 languages, at large, but it's around that sort of percentage. That content moderators only support about 20% of the languages actually offered on the platform. So that's one example. Of course, we're talking about the American experience for these key findings, but it's loopholes like that that allow this online hate and harassment to continue to fester. Here's some quotes and takeaways from the report. Again, I really encourage everybody to go read the report. We'll send it out in follow-up materials. But one of our interviewers, and again, this was done, basically we worked with a couple of social scientists to engage in deep ethnographic interviews of 15 individuals who had experienced online hate and harassment of some kind, who attributed some of it to their identity of some sort, and varied in different types of in age, in employment, in identity characteristics, etc. But in this particular case, somebody said being trans and being successful is all it takes to adopt harassment. And this was a streamer, somebody who was in the professional gaming world, and basically said just that. is that there was no sort of inciting incident for their harassment. It was literally just the identity characteristic and being online. This was a first-generation college graduate and non-profit professional. She said, "It's just infuriating. Someone sits behind their screen and tries to destroy everything I've worked so hard for. They don't have any consequences, and I have to defend everything I do." This individual, again, new college graduate, nonprofit professional, and part of the reason why we're not breaking down further some of these stories or anecdotes is that ADL was very careful to keep these individuals' identities as anonymous as possible in order to keep them safe because of the potential for further sustained harassment. But basically saying that she was put on the defensive. Her harasser emailed her employer and basically said she was a Latina supremacist and that she was racist. And what happened was there was questions and an investigation in her. I think for this particular case, there was a fake Facebook message that was sent around, etc. So she was there having to defend everything she did, even though her harasser had zero consequence. This is the same individual. An email addressed to an interviewee called her an unapologetic Latina supremacist and attributed anti-Semitic slurs to her. The email claimed she had a vicious anti-white agenda based on completely fabricated Facebook comments. Elaine, now that's a fake name that we used, was floored, just floored. She was shaking and couldn't bear to read the defamatory email all the way through. Last one. So this was a different streamer. The question was, what's it like to report harassment? And it was on Twitch. And the person said, you throw the report into the void. Is it ever satisfactory? One word answer, no. So again, these interviews allowed us to deduce gaps in the law, particular outcomes, and also suggestions for tech companies. So here are the recommendations that we had for tech companies. And I want to get into some of the legal nuts and bolts, and time goes by so fast as usual. So I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, but basically it was increase users' control over their online spaces, allow them to have families and friends, assist them in flagging things when they become the target of campaign or network harassment, etc. Second, improve the harassment reporting process. That's basically related to a lot of those issues that I flagged earlier on. And third is build anti-hate principles into the hiring and design process. ADL is doing a lot of work, especially in our Center for Technology and Society, about anti-hate by design and how the building blocks of a lot of these systems, they are diversified, that these questions are considered before minimum viable products come to market, and curtail or mitigate a lot of these issues. A lot of them come because there is not enough consideration of unintended consequences for victims and targets, who are the end users for a lot of these products. So now to get into what we're all here today to talk about, which is law and policy. Based on the quantitative research that I talked about, the online hate and harassment survey, the gaming survey, and then also the qualitative research that we did. The internet trolls are coming, as we kind of call it colloquially. We knew and were further confirmed as the year went on that more needs to be done in the legal and policy space. So what we did was engage a 50-state research project and at the federal level to understand what are the laws on the books to protect these victims and targets, mostly in the criminal space, but also considering the civil space. And were they sufficient? And if not, what can we do about it? We looked, this area is so vast. There's privacy issues, intimate partner violence issues. There's so many areas that we could drill down in, but ADL wanted to look specifically at these 4 general areas. So first, cyber harassment and cyber stalking, and I'll break down what we consider that to be. Then doxing, then non-consensual distribution of intimate imagery, and finally swatting. We wanted to see what are the laws on the books in all 50 states. Are prosecutors able to hold perpetrators accountable for this action? What First Amendment considerations are there? What criminal justice considerations are there? So first we wanted to, in order to think about these things, we wanted to consider the definition, both that's on the books across the 50 states and that's used, at large. So when we think of cyber stalking, think of the use of online expression to stalk a target. Most often, cyber stalking refers to a pattern of online activity amounting to a course of conduct directed at or concerning a particular person, which causes that person to fear for their safety or the safety of their family. So some of the differences that we think about when we think about cyber harassment and cyber stalking is that stalking really relates to conduct, a course of conduct that a perpetrator mounts against their victim or target. In fact, just today I was talking to a litigator in this space named Carrie Goldberg, and she was saying it's so often not about the words or the message. When we talk about First Amendment issues and consideration, it's about the amount of times a day that somebody is getting these messages, the way that they're being infiltrated in their space, the way that their inboxes are being overflooded or being hacked in some way. So it really all sort of converges. And that when we think about cyber stalking, we really do think about the expression, but how it works together in tandem with the conduct. This is a little bit out of order, but I'm going to talk about deep fakes. I'm thinking that I might return to this later on, but deep fakes are an area of not of law, but of online activity that we're looking at as it relates to other types of online crimes. You might have, I have the Nancy Pelosi picture up here because the scandal earlier in the year about a video being uploaded on a slower pace that made it seem like Nancy Pelosi was like under the influence or drunk or inebriated. That's technically not a deep fake, but it showed the problem with sort of fake or synthetic or computationally mutated videos and the way that AI can affect the way that we digest information. So that relates a little bit more to non-consensual pornography, to doxing, and to some of the other areas that we'll look at. But I do want to flag deepfakes for you, and I do have a video that further explains that. Unfortunately, based on our systems, videos aren't really working right now, so I will send that in follow-up materials. I'll go back to deepfakes in a little bit. But moving on to doxing. If I was in front of you all, I would ask you to raise your hand and say how many people have heard of the term doxing. So doxing, which comes from dropping documents or documents, is basically the internet-based practice for using digital or web devices to research and broadcast private or identifying information about an individual, group, or organization. Usually it's personally identifying information. So it's putting somebody's information online. And what's important about doxing is that it's putting that information up with the intent that it be used to facilitate some sort of crime or harassment against a specific victim or target. You might have heard someone's being doxed, and doxing is both like an umbrella term. Actually, it's three things. An umbrella term, it's starting to become a legal term, and it also is a criminal term, sort of in the way that we talk about, assault, right? There's the term that people say, they assaulted me, but we also know in the law, civil assault and criminal assault differ, and then also just colloquially talking about what it means to be assaulted also is differentiated. Same for doxing. Doxing, again, putting somebody's private information online crosses the board. It's that general concept, but also begs the question, what happens if I put someone's private information online? Let's say I put the information about a LGBTQ plus student group, maybe the members, maybe dorm rooms, and I'm not gonna say me, but hypothetically speaking, I always say with hypos, let's say I do this, and then I say, as a lawyer, you probably shouldn't do that. But let's say somebody puts that information on an anti-LGBTQ chat room in Facebook. Now that we would consider rises to level some sort of criminal doxing, especially with different words like "let's get them" or some sort of inciting context, because it's information being put up with the intent to facilitate some sort of crime against individuals. Now, that hypothetical is incredibly general, and of course, being a webinar, it's hard to break that down specifically. Every different hypothetical version of that may or may not rise to the level of something that we would consider criminal. But it's certainly scary, and it's certainly a method that's being used across the board in these types of situations. However, when you think about doxing, doxing is inherently expression and information based as opposed to cyberstalking, which is more conduct based. So First Amendment considerations for doxing are really important when we're trying to legislate in this space, because there are no laws except for in the state of Utah that actually talk about doxing specifically. We're trying to legislate in this space, thinking about the person's intent, mens rea, when they are putting information out is really important when you talk about criminal laws, civil laws, and then just the activity at large. You don't want to capture too much conduct when you think about creating or advocating for certain criminal laws. So that's a little bit about doxing. They're in the 115th Congress, so Congress last year, before the one that started end of January of 2019, so 2018, a comprehensive online bill was put forth that would be the first of its kind to make doxing a federal crime. Now, again, very particular doxing with the intent that it be used to facilitate a crime, and with the result of some sort of fear or emotional distress being the goal of a perpetrator, was put forth. Now, the bill wasn't passed. So again, only Utah has a specific doxing law on the books. Lots of states have laws about posting someone's social security number, but we're finding that with increased online hate and harassment, with perpetrators using this as a tool in their arsenal, it's much more than a social security number. It's photos of children, it's home addresses, it's dates of birth, it's paths to work, etc. So this is one area of law that we're looking at. Next is non-consensual pornography. Now, non-consensual pornography, also known as non-consensual distribution of intimate imagery, is defined as distributing sexually graphic images of individuals or depicting individuals engaging in sexual activity without their consent. Non-consensual pornography is also known as revenge porn, and we tend to say that that is not accurate because often these are not instances of revenge. These often are not instances where somebody has engaged in some sort of, videotaping or sending of images. It's procured in a lot of different ways. And non-consensual pornography is being put on the books as a specific crime across the board, which is having a lot of success. The Cyber Civil Rights Initiative is doing a great job with that. One area of the law, one legal gap that we think about when we think about non-consensual pornography goes back to deep fakes. What happens when somebody, their face is put on an image so realistically? Right now with computer technology, that ability is becoming easier and easier. Again, putting somebody's face on somebody else's image. Should somebody be held accountable in criminal court or in civil court for putting out a fake video of a target that looks just like them but actually isn't their body? Because a lot of these laws are written to say, hey, somebody's personal body, somebody's intimate parts, or somebody engaging in intimate activity should not be disseminated without their consent. But again, what begs the question, what if it's not their body, but it looks just like it? Those are questions that we're grappling with. How does the law keep up with technology? Because there's been a lot of research on the side of social scientists, on the side of legal scholars, etc., basically saying that the harm is just as real, the impact and effect are just as real, but the image is fake. So what do we do? So we are advocating that because the harm is just as real, and because this really does relate so closely to privacy and not about expression, the sort of like community good of putting this out there is not there in the way that maybe calling out somebody for doxing might be, or revealing some sort of problematic activity that just doesn't exist with non-consensual pornography. So so the advocacy around that space is fake or not. If the intent is that this image look real and tarnish somebody's reputation and cause them to have severe emotional distress, it should be included in this space. Swatting. Again, if we were all together, I would say, raise your hand and tell me if you've heard what swatting is. And some of you might have said yes, and some of you might have said no. It depends on the room I'm in. Sometimes I get 0 hands, sometimes I get, 60%, but never more than that. Swatting is basically the act of falsely reporting an emergency to someone's home with the goal of having a police unit or a SWAT team deployed to investigate. So again, calling in a fake emergency. But this is sort of bigger than like prank calls, because the goal is to have, a SWAT team or some sort of fully armed or materialized team come to somebody's house totally unbeknownst to them. So someone might call in, and this came largely out of the gaming space, but is, where individuals who were streaming while they were gaming would call fake emergencies into their opponent's house. They would somehow figure out their address and call it in, and then try to watch them as SWAT teams basically like knocked down their doors. What's happened are two things. One, this has definitely blown up beyond the gaming space. Public officials and private individuals have been swatted across the board across 50 states. It's also resulted in death. In 2017, an individual was shot because a SWAT team responded to the house based on a call that they thought was legitimate. And it was totally fake, between two gamers, one in California and one on the East Coast. And they called in a house in Wichita, Kansas that they thought was a third gamer's, but it was actually someone else. That person had moved out. So somebody totally unbeknownst to them, was approached at their front door. And again, this resulted in death. It's incredibly scary and being used by individuals in the gaming space, but also beyond that. Now, how do we hold people accountable? I think 10 states or less, I think it's 8 states actually exactly, have swatting laws on the books, and there's no federal law. Another issue with swatting is jurisdiction. So a lot of times these cases or these emergencies, fake emergencies, are called in across state lines. So when you're thinking about how difficult it is to hold someone accountable, not only is it the actual crime that's not really fully codified, but it's also things like, do we have the jurisdiction to hold this person accountable? What's the evidence about this? And so on and so forth. What about free speech? Now, I'm looking at the time and there's about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to whiz through some of this because I think I talked about this early on, and I feel like there might be questions about this. But basically, we know that free speech is incredibly important. It's a tool used by ADL, by other advocates, and that's something that we're not willing to give up. But we also know that free speech has its limits, that the First Amendment has its limits, etc., and that things like true threats, fighting words, incitement to violence, privacy, defamation, these areas are carved out because the benefits are not outweighed by the severe detriments of this type of speech, especially when speech is integral to criminal conduct. So as we are living our lives online more and more, the idea of what type of speech is and should be protected and what is a true threat online, what are fighting words online, is something that's being looked at more and more, and is something that I think is it's incredibly important as we approach this topic to know how important speech and First Amendment rights are, but also that they are not innumerable. Also, we talk about counter speech. So free speech and responses to issues that intersect with speech and expression are important to look at critically. What are the carve-outs? What's not protected? But also to look at as an awareness and advocacy perspective. That's where ADL also uses our tool. Can we use our bully pulpit? Can we raise general awareness and conversation to change behavior based on counter speech? It's counter speech again. It's using your own speech to respond to these issues, speaking out against what behaviors, what conduct, what activity, what's going on in the news that isn't acceptable. And again, using your own platform to be able to do that. It can do great things. It can prevent conflict from deepening. It can encourage dialogue. But sometimes counter speech does still contribute to polarization. We know that. So it's walking this line between the importance of counter speech, speaking up, shutting down, calling people in, having critical conversations, and also knowing that these types of rights are not, completely a free-for-all because of the importance of making sure that all people have their speech rights and that all communities are protected from some of the things before, like privacy rights, and that speech doesn't overwhelm other sorts of protection. So this is a video that ADL created that I'm not going to play. That's the takeaway for this slide. I'm not going to play it because the technical difficulties basically meant that the video was really muffled, etc. But I'm going to talk you through a little bit about what ADL is doing and our next steps. And this impact video is on ADL's website and also will be sent out in further materials. And it's a 1-minute video that sort of walks through ADL's approach to this issue, based on our qualitative research, based on our quantitative research, based on an understanding of the law. This is a real issue and it's not going away. So this 1-minute video talks about online hate and harassment and our campaign that we just launched, Backspace Hate, that is mounted to fight online hate and harassment and to protect victims and targets of this type of abuse, to speak out against it, to raise awareness about these issues so that people have a better understanding. One piece of data that I didn't share earlier is that in our February survey, we asked what percentage of American adults support strengthening laws against perpetrators, and 86% of adults across the spectrum, whether it was identity characteristic, political affiliation, etc., supported doing something about it. Because this online world is so, not linear, it's private, it's hidden, it's complicated, it's confusing. There's a lot of work to be done. And there's a feeling that perpetrators aren't held accountable, that people don't know how to talk about what it means to experience online harassment, who the victims and targets are, etc. So we're launching this campaign called Backspace Hate. And it's a campaign, again, to raise awareness, to strengthen laws, all the laws that I talked about earlier, cyber stalking, cyber harassment, doxing, and swatting. There are a lot of gaps. For example, cyber stalking. A lot of states have cyber stalking, but require that prosecutors prove that the person either intended for the individual to experience severe emotional distress, which is really hard to prove, especially and perhaps less necessary when you're talking about the level of conduct that someone's engaging in, right? We need to prove that intent if somebody is messaging somebody 1,000 times a day. And then also things like cyber stalking sometimes requires that somebody prove that the perpetrator lodged a credible threat, that they had the ability to carry out whatever threat it was that they said online. I'm going to XYZ you in ABC way. So could the person engage in XYZ activity? Could they do it in ABC manner? These are really hard to prove. And what we found is online crimes don't necessarily, they have the same effect, even if the person can't, even if it can't be proven that the person will, is able to carry out this type of whatever behavior they're threatening. The threat is actually what's going on the screen. It's not what's going to go on the ground. And then finally, the relationship between what's going on the ground and online is seen in so many spaces. That's Backspace Hate. Now the video, let's see if that works. No. So this video, again, it's our 1-minute video to just start the conversation and raise awareness. I encourage everybody to go to backspacehate.org, learn a little bit more about this. But what's interesting about this 1-minute video is it takes a lot of the experiences we've seen in the news, we've seen through our qualitative studies, and dissects them down into megabytes about individuals who have gotten rape threats online, who have gotten threats to be murdered online, whose home addresses have been posted, who have been swatting. And what we did was we hired actors to portray these particular stories, specific stories about specific individuals, in order to protect the individual's identities, but also in order to portray that these stories relate to identities, which relate to people experiencing this type of abuse. So what can you do? Raise awareness, get in the conversation, who in your community, who in your legal community, who in your internships and jobs that you work on are working in this space. Do they know about it? Do they not? What does doxing mean? What does swatting mean? Once we have a better understanding of this type of activity, then we can talk about it, and we can talk about solutions, we can debate, we can think about the best way to approach solving these types of problems, working at them, etc. Engage in advocacy. Go to backspacehate.org, contact ADL. We have 25 offices across the country, and are on the ground work to protect people, to raise up stories, to engage with community about really important issues. It's what keeps us. And then finally, stay in the loop. In order to solve whatever issue it is that you're passionate about, knowing what's going on, knowing trends, etc. It's critically important because things are changing so quickly, especially in the. So with less than 10 minutes left, but I can hang on a little bit longer if folks want to, I definitely love to open it up to questions. I see a question on the chat, but I might turn it over to Andrew and see what's the best way to spend the last part of our time. Again, I can hang on a little bit longer. Thank you for dealing with me. I know that there was some noise issues in the beginning, and I know I've talked for about an hour, and I appreciate your paying attention. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what questions you have.
Well, let's get to what Ariana has to say. Her question was, would the idea of doxing apply to individuals on Twitter or Facebook that are attempting to call out or find individuals that have been previously seen in videos portraying acts or expressing statements of hate?
That's a great question, Ariana, and it's something that we grapple with. So I think the answer goes to the definition that we're looking at. So doxing as a whole, doxing as something maybe in civil court, and then doxing as in criminal court. When we think about criminal doxing, that intent that a crime be facilitated against that person is really important, so that and the reason why that intent standard is so important for things like doxing and something that we say is far less important, if necessary, for things like non-consensual pornography or stalking, is because of that. We want to be able to call out or be able to shed light on problematic behavior. Now, your particular fact pattern, I'm not sure about, but one example might be Harvey Weinstein, right? Is it doxing to call out and to say, this individual engages in this behavior? I would certainly argue no. It's incredibly important for the community to know when problematic behavior is occurring. Now, if somebody is putting out information, especially of a non-public figure, with the intent that a crime be facilitated, that they be stalked, that they be harassed, that they be even worse, assaulted in some sort of way, that their cybersecurity be at risk, then that would be considered doxing. Doxing, again, it's like an umbrella term, so someone might casually say, oh, that person was doxed. I wouldn't, shake my finger at them, So in your fact pattern, that might be, somebody might say, oh, that person was doxed. But at the same time, is that somebody you want to be held accountable? Depending on the fact pattern, it varies, but probably not, at least calling out problematic behavior at large. So there's like nuance there, if that makes sense.
Excellent. We have another question from Michelle, which she says, what is the gaming industry doing to prohibit grooming by white supremacists?
Such a great question, Michelle. So ADL works really closely with the gaming industry, and the short answer is a little bit, or some, but not enough. So basically, the gaming industry is definitely understanding this, that their spaces are seen as social media spaces. So better oversight for AI to detect things in chat or in video is incredibly important. Having robust reporting policies so that a gamer can report, white supremacist supremacist activity. The idea is that if a white supremacist is online in the gaming space and they're recruiting, they might be also engaging in harassment of some kind to somebody else. So if you can flag those users, then you have a better idea of what's going on in that space. But really, like the policies that are put into place are not implemented the same across the board. For example, there's audio feature in a lot of gaming. Most games don't have oversight over audio functions. So these are things that really need to be thought about and need to probably be legislated at some level, unless the gaming industry can really lean in, do more, and prove that they are working on this type of issue.
All right, well, we have, I think, one more question, and this is from John. He asked, on an individual basis, what strategies can you recommend if we observe someone being subjected to online hate speech or harassment, and reporting to the platforms rarely seem to be effective? Is his comment to that?
Absolutely. John, your comment is so true. It's something that we found anecdotally. It's something we found in our qualitative study, and then of course also in our quantitative study, which, by the way, all of that's online, etc. What should we do, right? So as an individual, on an individual basis, I think there's a couple of things. One, talk about the issues. Talk about the issues with people that are in the space, that are not in the space, because when there's better awareness, as these things come up in the news, as these things are put forth in state legislatures, people will have a better understanding. I know it sounds small, but honestly, talking about the prevalence of this and experiences is really important. Beyond that, reach out to ADL. Our website has a reporting function so that if you're an ally, an observer, you can report. If you're a victim or target, you can also report. And we can provide you with some sort of support. Now, sometimes that support might be advice for, fast channeling, reporting to the social media platforms, using, if there's certain terminology or methods that might help based on each individual platform. And sometimes that support can be something different. It can be holding an event. It can be lobbying or testifying on behalf of the legislation that we're going to put forward. On an individual basis, I would also say, reach out if you know somebody to support them. We have a lot of, we have like a bullying prevention resource on our website. There's, going to law enforcement is often ineffective, but at the same time, filing something, getting things on people's radar, it is important. ADL and other organizations like the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, the Cyber Sexual Abuse Task Force, for example, in New York, does amazing things if the harassment is related to those issues specifically, gender-based violence and the rest. So it depends on your location. But across the board, I would say ADL is a great resource for that, and still reporting those things is important.
All right, let's take the last question, and it's from Jacqueline. And she asked, on your earlier slides, it says that LGBTQ plus accounted for 63% of online harassment. Was that in relation to the LGBTQ plus gamers, social media users in general, or do you have any context or specific harassment targeting LGBTQ plus communities?
Great question, Jacqueline, and I appreciate the need for clarification on that. So that was from our online hate and harassment survey at large, not the gaming survey, and it was American adult, and basically it was of the LGBTQ plus individuals who had experienced harassment, 63% of those said that in some part it was related to their identity as an LGBTQ plus individual. So that's the clarification for that. You can look for more about LGBTQ plus experiences in gaming on our website. The gaming survey does have sort of breakdowns in that space. That one was based on that. The last question was, do you have any context for specific harassment targeting the LGBTQ plus community? I mean, it's pervasive, anecdotally, and also quantitative and qualitatively. Motivations for that, they say that like the LGBTQ plus community and women and like gender-based online hate and harassment is sort of the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for other forms of harassment. So it starts there first. Why is that? I think that's something that would be really interesting to have a social scientist critically look at, those motivations. This question, I think, highlights that the fact that we need more information. We need better data. We need this conversation to continue. So the answer is yes, there's some information certainly, but not enough. Thank you so much.